Go for it, Dan. I was just going to do that, but I can let you do it.
Oh, up to you.
No, you check it away.
Well, Aaron Clauset is an associate professor in our Department of Computer Science here and in the Biofrontiers Institute. And he's external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. Aaron received his PhD in computer science with distinction from the University of New Mexico and a bachelor's of science in physics with honors from Haverford College. He was an Omidyar Fellow at the Santa Fe Institute as well. Aaron's work focuses a lot on networks, and in fact, in 2016, he was awarded the Erdos Renyi Prize in Network Science, which is really the premier prize in network science for research. And since 2017, he's been a deputy editor at Science Advances in Social Computing and Interdisciplinary Sciences. Beyond being an internationally recognized expert on network science and data science, as well as computational social science, which we'll hear a bit about today, Aaron is also an avid runner, swimmer, and biker, has completed multiple triathlons, and I believe is in the tapering phase of marathon preparation now. After today's talk, Aaron still has a marathon to run, but we'll leave it to him now to learn more about Toward a Science of Science.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, the marathon is on Sunday. It's the Boulder-thon, which is the first marathon in Boulder that finishes on Pearl Street. So it should be a lot of fun. So it's really a great pleasure to be talking in our colloquium, so I can get to tell you a little bit about some of the fun things we've been up to in my lab the past few years. Since we have been doing so much, I would like to ask that maybe we keep questions until the end, and I probably will not monitor the chat. I have 200 slides prepared, and so we really need to get going. Okay, so that was a joke, by the way. Okay, so the desire to predict discovery in science is really pervasive, and we want to predict what will be discovered by whom, when, and where. Individuals, they want to know what questions are useful and impactful and fundable to work on. Publishers and funders want to know what manuscripts or projects will be the most important for science. And hiring committees are faced with the task of choosing predicting which applicants will perform best and which will make the most valuable contributions over the course of potentially a 30-year career. That sounds like a very hard prediction problem. And of course, society is interested in predicting how best to allocate tax and other dollars to make technological, biomedical, and scientific advances that society benefits from. All of these kinds of questions are questions about prediction in science. And really, this idea is a simple idea, like how predictable is science? But it's a very old one, essentially as old as the scientific enterprise is itself. It began with philosophers and sociologists wondering, first of all, what the heck is science and how does it work and why does it work so well in practice? And it was mostly conceptual for decades and decades, focusing on the goals and the general approaches of science. And progress towards what you might call a science of science was really slow, in part because it was hard to get good data in order to test and construct theories. And the judgment of experts really seemed good enough. You ask a Nobel Prize winning physicist if this is good science, and they say yes or no, and you kind of believe them. Apropos, we are in Nobel Week, and we're hearing about the amazing discoveries and accomplishments of very accomplished scientists. And those scientists' authority for deciding what else is good science is sort of reified by the whole Nobel process. It's definitely kind of a club in that sense. So the state of the field, the science field, is messy, to say the least. So we have abundant but crude data today, in part because of the computer revolution. We have publication information, citations, people, funding. All of these things are just wonderfully abundant, massive sources of data, but it's also extremely crude because it only captures sort of what people were working on a few years after they were working on it. And so it's sort of a lagging indicator of where the frontier of science is. And it doesn't tell you a lot of that tacit knowledge that goes into doing research. If you could become a scientist just by reading the literature, you wouldn't need to get a PhD and take 5 years having an advisor and letting them teach you everything they know. You could just read about it instead and be self-taught. Unfortunately, we have very piecemeal theories in this field, that there's very few predictive models, lots of descriptive work of sort of looking in the data and finding patterns that seem interesting, but it's made very hard because the social dynamics are very complicated and there's an ecosystem of actors. And then you have competitive and cooperative dynamics, and these things make it really hard to pin down causality. But on the other hand, we had this growing interdisciplinary community. For the first 150 years or so, it was a relatively small group of people, the sociologists thinking about the sociology side of the question, information scientists thinking about citations and publications and so on. But nowadays you have computer scientists and physicists and economists and statisticians and biologists even thinking about these questions, in part because the science of science, it's very clear that if we had a better understanding of how to predict discovery, then we could make science better. We could accelerate discovery in many ways. So it's a very exciting time to be doing the science of science. In this talk, I'll try to convince you of a couple of key points. One that weaves through the first three of these topics: who produces the scientific workforce, the spread of scientific ideas, and productivity and provenance. And then I'll show you that it doesn't always hold everywhere when we talk about social inequalities in science. And then, assuming that we have some time at the end, I'll tell you about some other fun things that my group has been up to. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Who produces the scientific workforce? Well, in our work, we typically focus on faculty because faculty are special. And I say that not just because I'm a professor, but because they really do a lot of unique things in the scientific ecosystem. Of course, they make scientific discoveries. Many scientists do that, but they also produce scholarship. That's one of their tenets. So there are researchers in industry who don't necessarily produce scholarship. They do make discoveries, but they don't publish them. But key to what faculty do is that they train future scientists. And so the people who work in industry are trained by faculty, and other faculty are trained by faculty. And further, faculty have long and stable careers, which kind of make them, long-term players in this ecosystem, and therefore they can influence the dynamics and the direction of the scientific workforce for many, many years. This is both a double-edged sword. It's a pro and a con. If you want to change the demographics of the field, it can take a very long time for that to sort of filter through because of those long and stable careers. So in this section of the talk, I want to focus on this question of who hires whose graduates as faculty, because that's the scientific workforce component that I mentioned in the faculty component. And I am long-term interested in this other question of how does faculty composition shape what discoveries are made, but that's a much harder question to answer. And so I just want to state that I'm interested in it and then not talk about it anymore. Okay, so who hires whose graduates as faculty? Faculty hiring is a network. And this is because the vertices are PhD granting universities or departments. They're both producers and consumers of faculty. Faculty who train in our department who then get jobs at another department. That's an edge in which a person moves from department U to department V. And if we take the combination of all these hiring transitions, that gives us a hiring network that tells us the flow of people from one node to another. So to investigate the structure of these faculty hiring networks, to understand who hires whose graduates as faculty, who produces the faculty, we created a hand-collected data set of 19,000 faculty spanning 3 different fields: computer science, history, and business. In this talk, I'll mainly focus on computer science because this is a CS colloquium. And so, we like to talk about ourselves, I guess. But it spans 461 PhD granting departments. And a few places I'll mention history and business in terms of contrast. We chose these 3 fields because they are intellectually very distinct from each other. Computer science is very collaborative. They show a high volume of publishing, very technically oriented. Journal articles or conference papers actually are the main currency. In business, it's journal articles. It's also collaborative. History is more monographs. People tend to work alone a lot more. It's not as focused on journal articles, although there's some. So these 3 fields sort of cover a large fraction of the diversity in terms of scholarship. Okay, so in general, it's hard to talk about hiring without talking about prestige, but nobody wants to talk about US News and World Report rankings because they're terrible. But we can use the network to infer the rankings instead. This is an idea that has been rediscovered many times. When we worked on this particular project in 2015, I knew of maybe like 4 or 5 studies that had done something similar in various ways. Now I know of about 14. So it's really popular to think about hiring as being a way of inferring rank or prestige in the system. And it makes sense because hiring is a measure of the outcomes of education and training, whereas the US News rankings are typically measures of the inputs, things like fame, fortune, and sort of selectivity. And in the case of grad rankings, actually, it's purely reputational. So it's just about fame. So we're going to use the network, which is really about the outcomes. And so if a department hires somebody as faculty, they're really saying like, yes, that department that trained this person did a really good job because we're willing to like put down a lot of money and give them potentially a tenure track position. And so that's an endorsement in some sense. So this hiring network is also in some sense an endorsement of the training behavior of these different departments. So here we're going to use something called a minimum violation ranking in order to do the inference. It selects the ranking pi that minimizes rank violations. And a rank violation is just the idea that the edge points in the wrong direction. So in the bottom part of the slide, you can see that on the right, this is an actual minimum violation ranking of the little flow network on the left. And so most of the arcs point down in the hierarchy, and we've minimized the number that point up. Now, formally, this problem, finding the minimum violation ranking, is actually equivalent to something called the minimum feedback arc set problem, which is NP hard. But for small networks, you don't have to worry about it being NP hard. You can usually solve it using sort of a number of regular techniques. In this case, we used a zero temperature MCMC to sample the minimum violation rankings, because for a given network, there are often multiple rankings that all have the same number of minimum violations. So we just take the average of what comes out of that. The interpretation here is that the higher ranked nodes have greater placement power because they have more places where they can send their graduates. And the lower ranked places, like all the edges are going to point down, if we can, they have fewer places they can send them. So they have less sort of prestige or placement power in the system. So first, we're going to just check to see if these rankings make sense, if they're useful, and then we're going to examine faculty hiring networks through the lens of prestige that we've constructed through these hiring networks. So here's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the ranking that this method produces for computer science. We're just going to look at the top 60 out of 205 departments in the US and Canada. The prestige score on the y-axis tells you the rank. So 1 is the most prestigious, and 46 is the least prestigious for this sort of box. And then we're going to look at these 60 computer science departments. What we find is that we get a ranking that makes a lot of sense. It correlates with what the US News and the National Research Council rankings say. But in fact, when we do tests of the predictiveness of these rankings, we find that the prestige ranking that we derive is more predictive of placement, perhaps as expected, than these other rankings are. So all of these three rankings are capturing something sort of about the underlying social dynamics that construct our notions of prestige and importance in the field. But this one gives us a nice quantitative measure of the outcomes of the training. And it has these other nice features too. For instance, that the uncertainty is lowest among the highest degree nodes, right? Everyone agrees essentially on what the most important nodes in this network are. And the uncertainty grows as you get towards the middle, where it's more sort of uncertain or less clear, like what's the relative ranking of like Utah and Colorado? Like, I'm not sure. And we see similar results, but of course, different orderings for business and history. So this technique seems to be doing pretty well. Okay, let's look at the system through the lens of these hierarchies now. So if we look at who produces the faculty alone, we find enormous inequalities in the system, that faculty production is highly concentrated. 18 computer science departments, 9% of the system, produce 50% of all faculty. And among the faculty who are watching, yes, your departments are the ones that produce all the faculty. And I can say that with confidence because 50% of all faculty came from these 18 departments. Most departments, 3/4 of them, are net consumers. They have hired more faculty than they have produced. And the inequality is sharp even among the elite departments. So the top 10 departments in computer science produce 1.6 times more faculty alumni placed elsewhere in the system than departments ranked 11 through 20. And they produce 3.1 times as many faculty as departments ranked 21 through 30. So the differences even among the elite is also very, very sharp. So the differences are huge in this case. If we think about the structure of this network, like let's just imagine how many steps away in this network, this hiring network, is a node from all the other nodes. That's something called a centrality measure. And we can ask for each node as a function of how prestigious it is, how close is it to everybody else? What's the average distance? And what we find is that it's sort of monotonic, that the most prestigious universities are also the most central. They have sort of the shortest distance to go in the system before they've seen everybody. So from the position of Stanford in computer science, the world is small because their alumni are everywhere. But from the perspective of BYU, for instance, the world is enormous because to get to Stanford or anywhere else, you have to go through many hops in the network in order to get there. And so you can think about this network as being organized as sort of a core periphery type structure. There's the core in the middle, the high prestige nodes, and there's a periphery, which is low prestige nodes. But I like to think about it in a bit more of a spicy way, which is just more about like homeland and colonies, because the core of that network is what produces the faculty who occupy the colonies, but it doesn't go the other way around. And so in some sense, this implies that prestige is influenced via doctoral placement, that those people who go from the high prestige, high production places to faculty jobs in the rest of the system they carry with them the values and the research agendas, and they define what research communities even mean, and they even define departmental norms across the field. So there's sort of a massive influence that comes from being a high prestige node that comes via your large alumni network. So I want to conclude this section by really arguing that prestige is a structural variable in the science of science, that it, in this case, quantifies placement power directly. It's based on outputs, which is a nice contrast to the US News. And it reveals this sort of core periphery structure of academia that we all sort of know intuitively is true, but it really shows that faculty flow from the core to the periphery. There's a modest fraction that stay inside the core, of course, and a very, very small fraction flow upstream. But these hierarchies are really stable over time. And so this sort of implies that this prestige notion, the structural variable in the science of science, as we'll see, will have lots of ramifications for other parts of the system. It has its power because of faculty production. So the faculty are special in part because they drive this prestige structure overall. Okay, so let's turn a little bit and now ask the question of, well, what effect does prestige have on the scientific enterprise? So let's start with the observation that some ideas spread further than others. So in 2014, there was a nice little paper in Nature. It was a perspective article that talked about the most cited papers of all time. And the top 10 papers are cited just a mind-bogglingly number of times, something like 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 citations. These are astronomical numbers in science. And so these ideas have clearly spread really far. And the question is, well, why has that happened? Well, there are kind of three explanations that come to mind. One is that there are genuine differences in merit. And this is, of course, true at some level, that some ideas are just better than others, or maybe differently, some ideas are just worse than others. There's also a possibility that there are non-meritocratic social processes at play, things like fame or prestige or seniority or discrimination, even history effects, et cetera, that bias who gets opportunities and credit. And that's why some ideas spread further than others. But it's also possible that there are non-meritocratic structural factors, aka prestige, in which, in this case, scientists, the faculty again, are carrying ideas from their PhD to their faculty institution. And therefore, differences in placement power drive what we might call epistemic inequalities, that is, differences in how widely spread ideas are. And in some sense, this is just a mechanism of agenda setting theory, that the elite places set the agendas for everyone else. And that's why their ideas spread further than ideas from other places. So let's investigate this. Let's consider just this structural explanation. Here's a fun example that shows that this is known in history to be true, at least in some cases. So Fimin diagrams are a tool in theoretical physics invented in 1948 by Richard Feynman. And they were taught to a bunch of postdocs at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. Not taught by Feynman, it turns out, but taught by Freeman Dyson and a few other people. And then these postdocs took this technique, which was very technical, and they got jobs at other places. And then those ways of doing Feynman diagrams morphed a little bit, sort of evolved in some sense into different species. And that propagation of the idea from the IAS to these other places, the postdocs were the messenger, the sort of the packet that carried the idea with them. So this is the idea that we're going to try to test whether or not this is true for ideas in modern science, where we have things like the internet and everything. And so maybe it's just ideas can be everywhere all the time. Okay, so we're going to do two tests. The first test is with data, and the second test is with simulation. The first test is we're going to ask, does faculty hiring explain where an idea is studied? And if so, then it implies that prestige, in fact, drives the spread of ideas. And then the second, we're going to ask how big of an effect does prestige have on the spread of ideas? We'll do that by simulation. Okay, let's do the data first. So we're going to take our faculty hiring data for computer science, and we're going to match each of those people with their publication histories, which we get from DBLP, which is this online repository of publication information for computer science. And in looking at the spread of ideas, there's sort of two possibilities. One possibility is that a department had no one working on some topic X, some idea X, prior to hiring somebody who had a history of working on it, and then they continued working on it at that department, in which case we would see that this department is not working on idea X, they hire someone, and then they are working on idea X. Okay, so that's an example where idea X was adopted by hiring. The other possibility is that it's not adopted by hiring. And so in that case, that department is already working on idea X, and then they hire someone who works on idea X. And then we see that after they're hired, they're still working on idea X at the department level. And so there we would say that that idea was there prior to the hiring event. And so our goal here is just to go through the hiring data matched with their publication histories and just count how many times we see case A versus case B. And we're going to do it for 5 different topics or ideas in computer science: topic modeling, because why not? Incremental computing, deep learning, quantum computing, and mechanism design. I want to give a shout out to Josh Roth and Jordan Boyd-Graber, who helped us define the keywords that we use to sort of pull out these topics from the literature in this case. Okay, so what we observe in the empirical data is the following fraction. So like 35% of hiring events for topic modeling looked like they were from faculty hiring, and 39% of departments starting to publish on incremental computing look like faculty hiring, and so on. But the question is whether or not these things are significant, because of course, ideas are in many different places at many different times, and we want to know whether this is greater than expected at random. So we constructed sort of a fancy permutation test as a null model, which allows us to make a statement about whether or not we see a significant effect for hiring in this case. And what we find is that we do in all cases except for deep learning. And I think this is sort of an interesting exception that proves the rule, because deep learning exploded so quickly, right? Over the space of like 6 years, it went from being sort of a niche topic to being everywhere all the time. And that is just too short a time span for faculty hiring to have really driven that spread. Whereas for other things like topic modeling, which has been around for 25 years in some form or another, there's much more time for the generational training of faculty to actually spread the idea from one place to another. The same thing is true for mechanism design, quantum computing, and incremental computing. So we find that there is evidence that faculty hiring is indeed a significant driver of the spread of ideas. Okay, so now let's ask, how big an effect could faculty hiring have on the spread of ideas? So here we're going to use simulations. We're going to take this actual CS faculty hiring network, and then we're going to simulate idea transmission. And we're going to do it using this thing called the independent cascade model, which is kind of like a transmission model in which like a node can have a thing, and then it transmits it across its edges to its neighbors, and then they can have the thing, and so on. And the experiment we're going to do is we're going to vary the prestige of the origin point of an idea. So we're going to seed an idea starting at Colorado or at Utah or at BYU or at Stanford. So that's prestige. And then we're going to vary how transmissible is this idea. What's the probability that it gets transmitted across one of the edges in this hiring network? And then we're just going to measure like how far does it go? Like how many departments end up adopting the idea as a function of its transmissibility, given where it starts, at a prestigious place like Stanford or at a less prestigious place like Montana State University. Okay, so if it's the meritocracy, really, like if idea spread is just based on the merit of the idea, then we'd see these horizontal lines on this right-hand chart where I'm looking at how far it spreads as a function of prestige. So in this case, it doesn't matter where the idea starts. The idea lives and sinks, or sinks or swims based on its own merits, which is just the transmissibility, right? So the more transmissible the idea, the more places we'll see it, but in proportion to its transmissibility. So an idea that spreads 90% of the time across an edge will end up being at 90% of the nodes. So spread was independent of the birthplace. Okay, so I've set up the straw man. Now let me take a whack at it. Here's what the results look like running the simulation on the real CS faculty hiring network. So what we see is not those horizontal lines. Instead, that it depends on where an idea is born as to how far it goes. The red line corresponds to the most transmissible ideas. The purple line corresponds to the least transmissible ideas, the worst ideas. What we find is that bad ideas spread really far if they're born at very prestigious places, because everybody is close to them. Everybody is listening to them in some sense. But the best ideas, they actually spread no matter what. So even if a 90% transmissible idea is born at an obscure place, it will eventually percolate through the system. So that's somewhat heartening, but the bad idea spreading easily from elite departments is somewhat disheartening. And so in some sense, it really shows that like it's the good ideas from the mid-prestige places that are probably where we're missing things, because these are ideas that are better than ideas at the elite places, but they're not getting that boost from the structure of prestige that the elite place ideas are getting. And it really argues that prestige here is acting as an idea amplifier, that where an idea is born determines how far it goes. And if you want an idea to spread far, you should get your colleague at Stanford to claim credit for it. Okay, so again, prestige is a structural variable in the science of science. Here we've argued that scientists really carry ideas from their PhD institution to their faculty institution. And that prestige via this placement power idea, it can drive these epistemic inequalities. It can explain why some ideas are seen everywhere and other ideas are not. And in fact, the simulation suggests an exponential dependence between impact and prestige. So moving up in that prestige hierarchy exponentially increases your influence in the system in terms of your ideas. So this says prestige, which drives faculty production, also drives influence over the scientific agenda of the community. Okay, but how much effect do we see for productivity, for instance, right? So like we've established that the elite scientists dominate everything, but they also happen to work at elite programs. And so this really sets up sort of a tangled mess that like the elite scientists who get the most credit for everything, who produce the most papers and get the most citations, right? They work at these elite places, but they also got trained at these elite places. So which really is it that drives this impact? Is it their elite training or is it where they work? So the figure here, this is actually real data for computer science. It shows the black dots are the median publications for early career faculty, first 10 years. And you can see that the more prestigious a place you are, the sort of lower number for the rank, the more productive you are and the more citations you get. It's a factor of nearly 3 in productivity difference between the lowest prestige place and the highest prestige place. And the right side is log base 10. So it's almost a factor of 10 difference in terms of citations as well. So the difference between the elite scientists and the most elite scientists and the least elite scientists is enormous in terms of their influence inside the system. But this sort of coupling between where you work and where you train is this endogenous cumulative advantage, because the past achievements really correlate with the future achievements. So if we want to untangle whether it's the fact that really great people are at the most prestigious places, and that's what produces the great work, or is it that it's the prestigious places that amplify things, then we need to dig deeper and try to decouple these two effects. So there's 2 possibilities. One is where you trained, right? So you go to Stanford, you get the best training in the world, and you just do better science then because you have better skill, better talent, better temperament, et cetera, inherent characteristics, either latent or acquired. And so in that sense, faculty hiring is going to sort people based on their natural potential for good outcomes, for being great scientists and so on. And of course, we see this is true in the sense that the most productive scientists have elite pedigree. They come from Harvard or Yale or Penn or Stanford, et cetera. So this hypothesis is that where you train is what causes your future productivity and prominence. The alternative is it's where you work, which is that environmental factors like resources or maybe the people that you're surrounded by or support from your community or your department, that these things are what drive your productivity and prominence. And this implies that, well, maybe beyond a basic training, your output is really driven by your local environment. And for instance, if you were to move from one environment to another, we would expect to see your productivity and prominence change as a result of that movement. So this idea is basically this hypothesis that where you work causes your future productivity and prominence. So to test this, we're going to recognize that faculty hiring, yet again, is a quasi-natural experiment. We're going to take early career computer science faculty placements. We're going to mush them together, match them with their DBLP productivity, so which papers they write. And we're also now going to grab their Google Scholar citations. And we're going to do a matching experiment in which we find these effective twins in the data, people who have similar training. So they both got their degree at Penn, or they got their degree at 2 institutions that are very close together in our prestige hierarchy, but they had different placements. One went higher and one went lower than the other. And so if we look at the pre-hire productivity and prominence, we find that there's essentially no difference between these faculty, that having the similar training implies that they produce roughly the same number of papers over their pre-faculty years, and they acquire roughly the same number of citations. So now that we've matched, we've essentially controlled for all the pre-placement variables. And now we're going to look at what the different placement implies for their downstream productivity and prominence. And what we find is that they have different productivity and prominences, that the person who goes to the more elite place produces more, they write more papers, and they receive more citations than the person who goes to the less prestigious place. And so this implies that, again, prestige is a structural variable in the science of science, that it shapes so many aspects of what we do. It implies that elite training does not drive scholarly productivity or prominence, and instead it's the working environment that appears to drive your scholarship. So let's back up a minute and try to put these pieces together. So why do elite institutions dominate science? Well, in the first part of the talk, I argued that doctoral prestige predicts or causes faculty location, right? Prestige is the most important variable in terms of predicting where you're going to be placed in your faculty position. Now we've added to this a second piece, which is that your faculty location then causes your scholarly output. So the reason we see this correlation between doctoral prestige and scholarly scholarly impact is because of this mediating variable of where you work. That the most people who got the largest impact happen to also have the highest doctoral prestige because they get placed at the elite places. And that's what causes their productivity. So this is really an environmental mechanism for that endogenous cumulative advantage of elite scientists. It has, I think, some significant implications for the way we think about prestige and evaluate young scholars in terms of what they produced, right? In some sense, you can't separate what they've done from where they did it. Okay, so the first three parts of this talk, we're really pushing this idea that prestige is a fundamental variable in the science of science. But now I want to pivot and show that it's not always the dominant thing. Yes, academia is not a pure meritocracy, but social inequalities also shape what discoveries are or are not made. There are many, many questions here, many of which my lab is investigating. Here, I want to focus on one that was in a paper published this year on the unequal impact of parenthood. Okay, so this goes back to a very, very old empirical observation in the literature, which was dubbed the productivity puzzle by Cole and Zuckerman in '84. Their paper, which was a wonderful paper, actually, it says that they're summarizing 50 years of other literature, documenting the fact that men publish more than women. And in our data, we see the same thing. So this is computer science, history, and business. And we find that relative to when you start your faculty job, the gap opens up between men and women in terms of the number of publications they make. And so we see the same pattern that Cole and Zuckerman saw 40 years ago in our data. There has been a lot of work on this question because it's kind of a perplexing mystery. And there have been many explanations offered, including things like institutional factors, the idea that, well, women are more likely to end up at an institution that is not research intensive. And so if you just average over men and women in general, many of the women aren't at places that value productivity. And so their productivity is lower. And so therefore you're going to see this gap. So maybe that's it, that it's not actually an individual level, it's actually where they sit in the system. Or it could be teaching and service work. Maybe women have heavier loads of teaching and service, and so they have less time to write papers than men. Or it could be research specializations. Maybe men are drawn to fields where productivity is higher, and women are drawn to fields where productivity is lower, where you just don't have to write as many papers, or each paper takes more time to write. It could be biases in peer review. It could be that the quality of writing. This is a lovely paper that showed that women take longer to do revisions on papers, and they're more careful about their writing, whereas men just sort of like bang out the next version and send it off full of grammatical mistakes and everything. And so obviously it's a difference in time. And so the men will write more poorly worded papers than the women. And that might cause some amount of a gap. And then there's of course differences in career lengths, that if men have longer careers, they will write more papers and so on. So all of these things have been offered in the literature over the past 40 years, but the evidence for each of them is sometimes marginal. It's difficult to get really good data here, but the one that everyone keeps coming back to, but is still very difficult to pin down, is parenthood, because it's sort of obvious that, like, well, women do something different than men during parenthood, especially at the beginning. And then the gender roles that we play in modern society also reflects the fact that women do different things in parenthood than men. And so probably that has an effect, right? So our approach was to try to pin this down for good. And we're going to do it by getting data on the timing of parenthood for faculty. We're going to combine that with information about their productivity over time. And just because we wanted to, we went and also got the leave policies for all the universities in our sample. So to get the timing of parenthood, we had to ask people when their kids were born. So we ran a very big survey of tenure track faculty in computer science, history, and business, which we asked them questions like, please tell us the years that your children were born. We asked them a bunch of other questions, which I'll talk about in a minute. We only surveyed US research intensive institutions, meaning PhD granting. And so already that eliminates one of the confounders that had been documented in the literature previously, which is this idea that if men and women end up at institutions that differ in their research intensity, If there's a gendered effect there, then that could explain the gap. Well, okay, we'll just focus on the most research-intensive places. We'll just focus on tenure-track faculty. So in some sense, the environment that these men and women work in should be the same. They value the same things. They push the same things. Tenure is granted on the same things, et cetera. The publications we absorbed from DBLP is the same data set we had before, but now we're going to add to it the information for history and business. And then for the institutions involved, we have their prestige ranking, and then we also got their parental leave policies, which we collected by hand. And I'll tell you some gnarly stories about that in a minute. Okay, so first, a little summary of the results, which is, this actually surprised me to some degree, that academia really is a family business, that of the faculty who responded to our survey who are over 40 years old, so arguably are beyond their child rearing years, or child birthing years, the vast majority of them have kids, 82% of men and 71% of women. And in fact, this was really mind-blowing. 40% had their first child prior to their first faculty job. This definitely goes against the stereotype you hear of people waiting until they get tenure to have kids. If 40% had kids before they even get their first faculty job. Interestingly, for men and women, the age at which they had their first child was the same, 33 years old, which is older than in the general US population, by men for 2 years, but by women for 7 years. And it's maybe no coincidence that 7 years is pretty close to the length of a PhD. We also found that having children does not correlate with institutional prestige. So unlike some of the war stories that you may have heard from your colleagues who are at MIT or Stanford, where these things are kind of a pressure cooker, it turns out that in general, we don't find a correlation, that people at these high prestige places have kids at just the same rate that the people at the low prestige places do. And the average number of kids per faculty is a little bit higher for men, 2.2, a little bit lower for women, 1.8, but roughly, 2 or so. So not that much different from the general population. Okay. So our setup to try to pin down the effect of parenthood, what impact does it have on productivity, is to use causal inference. So we're going to use this technique called comparative interrupted time series. It's a matched pair design in which we choose a parent and a non-parent, and then we assign a counterfactual child event to the non-parent so that we can align their productivities and then measure the difference moving forward after the event. So the counterfactual assignment is somewhat complicated. We tried 4 different sophisticated ways of doing it and found that none of them was as good as just drawing empirically from the distribution of age at first child. So what we do is we first match on various attributes of people born in the same year, work in the same discipline, are the same gender. And then we match this non-parent versus parent. The non-parent, we then assign a year in which they had their counterfactual child. And that allows us to then take the non-parent's productivity and align it based on the counterfactual event with the actual event for the parent. And now we can compare productivity prior to the kid and after. Okay. And the effect size that we're going to measure here is this counterfactual effect, which is if you had not had the child, what would have been your productivity? And we use the non-parent as the way of measuring that difference. Okay, so here's what it looks like for computer science. So I've hidden the after kid data so as to make it clear what the pre-kid data looks like. So women on the left, men on the right. With children are the solid circles, and without children are the open circles. The baby event is the 0 on the x-axis. And so you can see that first, there's something weird about this data, which is that the parents are more productive than the non-parents, even before they have kids. This is weird. And we scratched our head for a long time about this. And the best explanation we came up with was that this is selection, that people who are less productive and want kids select themselves out of the faculty market before they become faculty. They know that being faculty is time consuming and doesn't allow much time for kids. And so they recognize that if they have kids, then they might not make it as faculty. And so they leave. And so these relatively less productive people chops off the lower end of the distribution and shifts the average up. I'm only showing you averages here. Okay, so now we've done our alignment. Let me show you what it looks like after the child event. So what we see is that men coast on exactly as we saw before. There's a gap between with children, without children, and that gap is basically maintained after the birth of the child. But for women, we see a sharp difference, that the productivity of the parents, which was previously higher than the non-parents, drops relative to what it would have been, and now they're just as productive as the non-parents. So this is a negative shock to their productivity for women, but not for men. For computer science, it's a 17% shock, a 17% drop in their productivity. For business, it's 24%, and for history, it's 48%. And we interpret this difference here as being perhaps related to the fact that the collaborativeness of these fields differs, right? History is much more of an independent operator kind of field. There's less collaboration. People don't run research groups. There's fewer people to sort of help your productivity along while you are busy attending to a child. Whereas in computer science, we have research groups, we have collaborators, this is the culture that we have. And so in some sense, the shock is softened because we can lean on our collaborators while we are busy with the kids. In men's publications rates, there's generally no shock, which implies that the positive shocks, people who take parental leave, for instance, and write more papers, are just as frequent as the negative shocks, people who take parental leave and actually reduce their productivity, okay? So remember, we're talking about averages here and not the distributions. The CS shock is so large, it turns into almost 18 papers fewer over the first 10 years after the kid. And if you look at the average productivity, it takes about 5 years of solid work to produce 18 papers. And so that means that the mothers are 5 years behind the fathers and other men in terms of productivity. And they'd have, in order to catch up, the men would have to stop publishing for 5 years, and then the women would have caught up. So this is an enormous shock to the productivity of women. Okay. So we also asked on the survey about parental leave, which I mentioned just briefly a moment ago, so let's dig into that. What we found is that half of women and 20% of men said that the leave policies are actually somewhat or very important to them choosing their current faculty job. And so this implies that strong leave policies are really an underused recruitment and retention tool. But, and this is where the war stories come in from reading these parental leave policies, only 64% of institutions offer any paid parental leave. And let me tell you, these policies are confusing and full of Byzantine rules. Things like you have to get a doctor's note certifying that you are medically disabled after the birth of your child in order to be granted paid parental leave for 6 weeks. Or you have to negotiate with your department chair for special arrangements in order to receive any kind of leave. One thing we found is that the leave policy often don't specify what kind of leave you get. Do you get leave from teaching or research or service? They just said, you're on leave. The average amount of leave that people would get was very close for men and women. Many places have gender neutral parental leave policies, which is good, but the Byzantineness of the rules is kind of amazing. It's clearly a barrier to being used. Okay, so to summarize here, what we find is that basically parenthood is the causal effect that explains the gender gap, the productivity puzzle. It explains the vast majority, between 86 and 97% of the gender productivity gap. We find that fathers actually don't get systematically a boost from parental leave. Parental leave is especially important to women in terms of recruitment and retention. We do find that things are changing, right? So what I showed you was looking at faculty that span about 40 years of when they got their PhD. If you split the data based on people who got their first faculty job before the year 2000 versus after the year 2000, you find that the gap is closing, which is heartening. It suggests that the norms that we follow in terms of these social inequalities are in fact moving in a direction towards less genderedness. Fathers essentially are taking leave at increasing rates. It's doubled in the past 20 years, and the gap is shrinking in accordance with that. So in this sense, the unequal impact of parenthood is something that is independent of prestige. So social inequalities are one kind of structural variable or individual variable in the science of science that shapes the kind of scholarship that gets done. And then prestige is another kind of structural variable. Okay, so let me come back and revisit my original ideas about the science of science, right? So I want to leave you with this quote, which I think is a good reminder that really little in academia makes sense except in the light of prestige. That prestige is such a fundamental variable in the science of science because it pervades and structures almost everything we do. It shapes who gets faculty jobs and where. It shapes who works on what ideas and which ideas spread further. It shapes how much scholarship is produced, and who knows what else. That would be something we certainly are interested in doing, is finding out what other things prestige influences. But prestige has a limit. There are individual effects that drive inequalities in science as well. And the case in point is this unequal and very gendered impact of parenthood. So if we step back and look at the whole field again, right? So I said in the beginning that there are sort of these three characteristics: abundant but crude data, piecemeal theories, and this growing interdisciplinary community. The contributions that my group has made to this emerging field or this interdisciplinary and growing field, is we have created these new rich data sets by combining hiring information with publications, citations, the topics of the papers, along with surveys to get at things that are not represented in these big, crude, abundant data sets. And we've shown that prestige really is a fundamental variable around which you can organize some of these other piecemeal theories. In many ways now, when I read the literature, I'm always thinking in the back of my head about, like, okay, did they account for the effects of prestige? And many studies are not. So clearly there's a lot more work to be done to try to integrate this prestige variable into our understanding of other kinds of effects. And I have to say, it's really fun to work in this area because you get to work with all sorts of different people, including sociologists, psychologists, ecologists, physicists, and more. And that's just in my research group right now. So there are lots of things we're working on currently, things we'd like to investigate now. We have a couple of projects, more like 8 projects I've written here, looking at things like the socioeconomic roots of faculty or the demographic trends and representation. So understanding more about the composition of the scientific workforce. We have a nice project now looking at retention and the leaky pipeline. So why is it that as you look up in the ranks and faculty, it gets increasingly male? And of course, that's sort of expected to some degree because the people who are very senior full professors now got their PhDs back when there were many fewer women getting PhDs. So you expect some amount of inequality in this way. But there's a huge literature in this topic of the leaky pipeline, just as there was on the impact of parenthood. And so here we're trying to do the same trick we did before, which is to combine this objective sort of crude but abundant data with survey information to really get at this question of what factors cause differential rates of retention. We're interested in the effects of social networks on success. How much does who you know in academia drive your own individual success? We're looking at the functional roles of scientists in terms of how they contribute to the scholarship. Are they methodologists or theoreticians, or do they collaborate with domain experts, et cetera? We're thinking about self-hiring, so like hiring somebody who got a PhD at your own institution, and competition between departments. We're thinking about how does prestige help or hinder scientific progress? Like I've articulated this idea about this prestige hierarchy. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for science? In fact, it could be both. On the one hand, it certainly accelerates the spread of good ideas. And so deep learning is one idea that didn't need that prestige hierarchy, but other things might have benefited from it, so that good ideas can get other places much faster than they would if they had to diffuse through a more egalitarian network. But it could also hinder scientific progress if the good ideas in the mid-rank places are not being entertained and heard as much as they should be. And then sort of an overarching long-term question that I'm interested in is trying to figure out how we can estimate how many and what kind of discoveries aren't being made because of these various kinds of social and epistemic inequalities. So that's my summary of the science of science stuff. I see I have maybe a couple minutes left. So I want to first thank my many collaborators on these projects. These are just 6 papers that I talked about in the first part of the talk. Thanks especially to Allison Morgan and Sam Wei, who are PhD students in my group, who are now at Twitter and Spotify. Only is a postdoc in my group, along with Dimitrios Economou, who's now at Queen's University, Mike Hofer, who is still here at Colorado. And then my senior collaborator, Sam Arbesman, is at Lux Capital, Marta Galesic is at Santa Fe, and of course, Dan Larimore is here in the audience. I want to highlight the fact that the Unequal Impact of Parenthood paper was awarded a very prestigious prize this year from the ISSI. This is the International Society for Scientometrics and Informametrics. It received the Paper of the Year award. So among all the papers in the science of science, that paper was chosen this year as the paper of the year, and that's a great honor for Ali, who was the lead author on that project. Also, thanks to the funders, NSF has been very generous, along with the Air Force, who is currently funding our work. Okay, so I see that there's a hand up, but I want to just take 2 minutes to then talk about some other fun things. This will be quick. Because my group is not just about science of science, we also do stuff on networks. For instance, there's a paper by Anna Broido, who's now at Apple, in my group, which took this idea that was sort of unifying theory in network science. And we asked, like, okay, can we test this thing with as many networks as we can? And we showed that it wasn't really as unifying an idea as it was imagined to be. This created quite a controversy in the network science community, which was both fun and terrifying. And then we also published a paper also on networks last year looking at how to do link prediction. This is work with my former PhD student, Amir Kassemian, who's now at Yale, and Homo Hossein Mardi, who's now at Penn, also one of our graduates, along with 2 collaborators, Aram Galstian and Edo Araldi. in which now we looked at like, can you construct an optimal algorithm for predicting missing connections? This has connections with recommendation algorithms as well, but it's actually a harder problem that they deal with. We found some fun things like, for instance, social networks are just easy to predict missing links for, whereas biological networks and technological networks are just seem to be harder. It may be that we haven't spent as much time doing work on predicting missing links, and so when you use meta learning to combine these different techniques, like you just haven't figured out the right predictors yet. Or it could mean that, in fact, these networks are fundamentally harder, and that's sort of future work that we're interested in pursuing. And then finally, more recently, an undergrad who worked in my group, who's now working at Arpeggio, which is a biotech company based in the biotech building on East Campus, who's applying for MD, PhD programs. He and I worked on this project when we asked, like, can we optimize PCR? Now, I don't need to explain what PCR is to everybody because of COVID, but basically, this is something that's used in laboratories everywhere, and it fails about 40% of the time. Like, so these are expert scientists designing PCR experiments in the lab to amplify genes, and like half the time it doesn't work. They can't get it to work, and then they have to try different parameters and they do it. So we crowdsourced PCR experiment data from the building, and then learned a simple predictive model for PCR outcome. And we found that we can improve the outcomes by 25%, which PCRs are cheap. They're like $3 a piece, which think about how many PCRs are being done for COVID these days. It's a lot of money being spent on PCR. So if you could make it more efficient and more predictive, then you can save a lot of money because there's just so many PCRs being done in research laboratories across the country. So we estimate that if you use our tool, you could probably save $3 million a year, and the NIH could then spend that money on like new research as opposed to just like rerunning PCRs. So I want to stop there and say thank you. It's great fun sort of telling you about some of the things my lab has been up to, and I think I have a few minutes for questions.
Aaron, thank you for a great talk. What an interesting topic. When you talk about networks, it made me think about a wonderful book by the historian of science, Michael Gordon, who talks about how we went from having Latin as an international language of science to how that became English. And he talks a lot about the effect of the Second World War and its travel restrictions on disrupting networks of sending grad students and postdocs to your colleagues' labs, particularly in physics. And I wondered if it would be possible to study the other direction and how you would do it. And what I'm thinking of here is how might the question of whether or not your native language is the language that you publish in has an effect on your professional success or lack thereof?
I think that's a fascinating question, and also a very important one for understanding the increasing internationalization of science, because there are a few countries for whom English is a native language, but there are many, many more people for whom it is not. And China is a very interesting example. They are a very strong powerhouse in science, and they're all writing papers in English. And I think that trying to quantify that effect would be tricky, but I certainly think that trying to do so would shed a lot of light on sort of the implicit advantage that English-speaking scientists enjoy in terms of making their ideas heard. So trying to quantify that sort of penalty that might be had by English not being your first language to varying degrees, I think would be a very interesting direction for future work. Okay, if
There's a
no
bunch
one's
of
going
things
to
in
ask,
the chat, Aaron. I don't know if
guys.
you want to take the chat or you want people to raise their hand and ask questions.
I can try to buzz through the stuff in the chat. I'll read the question aloud so that everybody can see what I'm thinking about. Okay, so Claire asked, your prestige measure is a function of the hiring graph, so correlating better with it is to be expected, right? Yes, so this was the statement that our prestige ranking is more predictive than US News and the National Research Council rankings for predicting placement. And it's true that like we're basically fitting to the prediction to the placement data, and so we should do better. When we did this test, we did the standard out of sample construction with the fit the model to the subset of the edges and then try to predict some held out set. So we do have some confidence that there's some generalizability there, but certainly when in a follow-up paper when we looked at trying to build a predictive model of placement that included things like productivity measures and doing a postdoc and not, we still found that prestige was the most important variable in terms of predicting where you were placed. Okay, so second question, what do you mean about PCRs failing? So PCR is, the output of PCR is a gel, and if your gene was amplified correctly, then you see if they're band in the right place on the gel. And so a PCR fail will be no band or bands in the wrong place. And so we had our participants who were all co-authors of the paper. They actually coded their PCR outputs as being like, yes, this is correct, success, or it was dirty in the sense that the bands were in the wrong place, or it was a fail in which I didn't get a band at all, so the gene was not amplified. Next question, do you think there's an effect from highly prestigious industrial research, for instance, AI at Google or IBM, robotics at Boston Dynamics, on the spread and prestige of ideas? Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. We have not had many good ideas for how to measure and quantify the effect of industrial labs on the spread of ideas. And certainly in artificial intelligence and robotics, industrial labs are very key players. We could potentially look at the faculty who did postdocs there or who collaborate with people who work at those places. In a little bit of work we've done, we did find that researchers at industrial places, they write papers in different ways than faculty do. Typically their productivity is much lower. In our conversations with colleagues at these kinds of places, they tell us that even the internal evaluation metrics, the things that the companies prioritize for their researchers is different than in academia. In academia, it's pretty straightforward, like you write a bunch of papers and you make them public. Whereas in industry, it's a more complex objective function that the researchers are optimizing that includes things like real world impact, like did you write code that is being used at the company or used in a product? And so trying to really get a handle on the influence that those labs have, I think is going to be more difficult because the objective function is more complicated. There's more ways to contribute there. So it makes it harder to measure. Colin asks, for the unequal impact of parenthood, did you explore differences in cultural factors? For example, extended family households, socioeconomic background, the prevalence of gendered caregiver roles in an institution's cultural surroundings. We did not investigate that question in part because we did not have data that was sufficient for asking and answering them. Very interesting questions, and certainly it seems like it would be a contributing factor. In our case, we wanted to focus on just like what's the main effect that we see in terms of the means. But if you wanted to build a model that tried to predict what would be the gendered effect on parenthood for an individual person, then certainly the covariates and the contingent factors that describe their particular life would likely be important. And you then need to get that data, which might be a little bit complicated. Okay, Jed asks, to what extent do you anticipate there is a bias in forms of scholarship beyond indexed publication? Oh, that's a great question. So in our case, we just looked at certain types of publications. So CS conference publications, archive papers, things that look like, you know, the traditional types of scholarship. But today, there are many other ways to contribute. The industrial example is one in which maybe you contribute to products. But even on the academic side, writing and maintaining software is a very important way of contributing to scientific knowledge. And so trying to build better ways of measuring those things so that we can have a more multidimensional representation of productivity and contributions is definitely needed and important. We wanted to look at just the crudest, simplest measure, and for at least the impact of parenthood, the fact that we see such a big impact, even for that crude measure, suggests that probably the impact is even larger. Okay, Owen asks, do you anticipate transforming survey results into metadata for some of the faculty predictive models? Well, the IRB has some opinions about that. Generally, they want us to keep survey responses separate from other kinds of models. But in general, we would very much like to do something like that, in which we take information that we get from surveys that is not present in the bibliographic databases or on people's CVs, and try to use that to enrich the models that we make about how scientists behave and what kind of discoveries they make. So I say that in the long run, we'd like to move in that direction. It's just, there are many difficult questions to answer in terms of how to do that in an ethical way. Okay, and that ends the questions from the chat. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you, Aaron.